Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. I am back in Amsterdam after a 3-week visit to Guatemala. Hope you enjoyed some of the videos that I shot over there. And in today's video, I want to talk about the topic of cowardice and how one of the latest insights that I realized during meditation this week was how there is at the very center of the ego an essence of cowardice that we hardly dare to admit to ourselves. And I wanted to start by perhaps redefining what cowardice is now that this insight has arisen in my mind. See, normally we think about cowardice as someone who doesn't dare to do things, someone who is paralyzed by fear and doesn't have the courage to take action. And in contrast to that, we think that that courage is someone who is not paralyzed by fear and therefore goes out there and takes action. But if we go one level behind, or rather one level before action is taken or not taken, my current understanding of cowardice is the mixture of fear and shame, so that we become ashamed and therefore unwilling to admit that we are afraid. And so I would define or redefine cowardice as the unwillingness to admit our fear. And I would redefine courage as the willingness to admit and therefore to directly feel our fear. Now, that changes things a little bit because it makes cowardice and courage less contingent on what action we are taking on the external world. And this is, I think, very important because for a real alchemical transformation of our fears and identifications, which is what the ego is made up of, it is clarification that does the trick. It is not action, strictly speaking. I have a great anecdote from a lady that I've been working with for nearly 2 years now. And she describes how, first of all, she has a tattoo in her arm that says fearless. And she described herself as very sort of bold and brave. And one specific instance is she's afraid of heights. And whenever presented with a sort of very tall cliff, a kind of like one of those cliffs that you can dive into the water from, she would be the first in line to just throw herself at the opportunity of confronting her fear. And she's come to realize that only preserved the spirit of cowardice in her, because in rushing towards what she was afraid of, the one thing that she didn't allow herself to do was to really actually feel the fear. And therefore it was ironically her acting out the things that she was afraid of. She was preventing herself from feeling the fear, and therefore this preserved the spirit of cowardice inside her. And it's funny because through our work, she's actually decided and eventually carried out the striking through that tattoo of fearless. And she says, no, actually, I'm afraid. I feel afraid. There's a fundamental fear that comes from being human. There's a fundamental fear of being a sentient little bundle that is limited in physical abilities, intelligence, lifespan, the ability to procure safety, sympathy from external sources, there's a fundamental, a very deep-rooted fear that comes from that, an incapacity to be omnipotent in a world that is painful and deadly, fundamentally deadly. That brings very, very deep existential fears. If the person who appears to be all, be a go-getter and be bold and confront this and that and the other, and has not come into touch with fundamental fear, is still hiding away from the essence of cowardice, which is the core of the ego self. It's the shame-based unwillingness to acknowledge that we are, in our heart of hearts, very, very afraid. And so, in doing self-inquiry, in asking, who am I? The typical turning our attention into trying to figure out what our core sense of self is made of. You eventually come to realize that your core sense of self is made up of this bundle of fear and shame, or to put it differently, unwillingness to acknowledge that our heart is quivering with fear in its center, and this is the essence of cowardice. So ego identity, at its very core, is cowardice, and it is and cowardice is a very tricky thing, because it's afraid by definition. So it's afraid to look at its fear, right? It's ashamed of it. It's got all these layers of protectiveness that makes it unwilling to look at its fear. And that's where eventually the more we bore into our sense of self, the closer we come to pure fear circuitry that doesn't want to feel itself and it doesn't want to be brought to the surface. It fights tooth and nail not to be felt. And I've indicated to this in the past, in the sense of when we are doing self-inquiry in an effective way, it should feel very, very uncomfortable. That's the hallmark of good self-inquiry, especially when we start to come to really the core of what we feel ourselves to be in our egoic identity. It just feels like pure discomfort. It's pure fear. It's the essence of cowardice that doesn't want to feel itself. It's just obscuration of fear, shame of fear, that doesn't want to feel itself. So this is interesting also because it changes our paradigm into in what bravery is about. We often mistake bravery in the capacity to push through fear or confront fear, but it's nothing of the like. Bravery is the capacity to fully admit and come face to face with the fact that we are terrified. That's what bravery is about. Is in the acknowledgement, is in bringing fear fully to the surface, fully into the light of awareness, where it can be fully felt, fully acknowledged for what it is. And that's what bravery is about. That's the hero's journey. And so that's today's thought. Very simple realization, but it is an insight nonetheless, because I have touched the essence of cowardice that sits within. And it felt horrific. And it's just the last thing you want to do is feel utterly vulnerable and incapable of doing anything about it, right? Like this essence of pure fear and the cowardice of not wanting to acknowledge this, right? Which covers it up with thoughts of shame and implications and all these kind of things. So that needs to be worked through a very persistent introspection into the sense of self, the core sense of self. And the closer you get to your core sense of self, the closer you get to the circuitry of fear in the center of the heart, and the closer you get to full acknowledgement of the fact that you have been unwilling through cowardice to feel afraid, really. So It's a process that takes a while because that circuitry protects itself. It doesn't want to be felt. And the sense of self is, if nothing else, a layer of explanations, excuses, tactics, and ruminations in the head that are all distraction mechanisms so that you don't have to feel the essence of cowardice and vulnerability in the center of the heart. But that's where this exploration leads, because that's what the sense of self is fundamentally made of. In case you are wondering why the sense of self is fundamentally made of fear, then I have a playlist about the ego. And I'm also making a book review of The Pearl Beyond Price. And I also have a playlist there which explains how the ego comes about and explains how and why the ego is fundamentally a defense mechanism to ward off a sense of vulnerability or let's say input that we are not prepared to feel when we are infants, and then it carries on to become a full-blown personality, but at its core is fundamentally narcissistic and fundamentally afraid. So I hope that resonates with you guys, but I'm also, as usual, curious to hear what you make of it. So do share it in the comment section. And once again, if you feel that this is content that others may benefit from, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel far more visible out there. And I also find it super motivating so that I continue to make these videos. I'll be back with more content pretty soon. Thanks for listening. Cheerio. Bye-bye.